Well, thank you. It's an honor to be here and an honor to be asked to begin this important series. So I've entitled the talk, Justice in the Neoliberal City, in part because this is what we find ourselves in, and this is what I reacted to when writing my book, The Just City, because the Just City is quite different from the neoliberal city, or what a number of book titles have called the competitive city. Since 1975, what we've seen within urban public policy, urban planning, has been a turn to what has been labeled neoliberalism, a rather peculiar rubric, actually, particularly for American students, because in America, liberal always means on the left. So why neoliberal should mean right-wing is a little puzzling, but it traces back to 19th century economists who were called liberals because essentially they believed in the free market and free trade. So it was an idea within economics of loosening constraints, of getting rid of mercantilism. In the period after, in the post-war period, and most especially actually in the Netherlands, we saw a huge extension of the welfare state. The building of a great amount of social housing, of various kinds of redistributive programs coming out of national governments, but often administered by local governments. However, in mid-1975, partly precipitated by the oil crisis, there was corporations began to have a declining rate of profit, and both the local state, that is governments at the municipal level, and national states began to have fiscal crises. They were not getting as much in revenue as they were committed to spend. At this time also was the rise of what some have called the new competitors, the Asian countries, which were suddenly competing and winning in terms of export markets. So what we're talking about at this point is first Japan, then Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, that they became manufacturing giants, so that the multinationals based in the West began to attempt to cut costs in order to meet their competitors. Earlier, what they really could do would be simply to raise prices in order to cover the taxation that was supporting the welfare state. Another of the reasons for the rise of the welfare state was the existence of the Soviet Union and the threat of communism. There was an effort to show that under capitalism, the working class could still do well, that they didn't need to be in a socialist or communist environment. So the collapse in '89, and the few years thereafter of the Soviet Union, meant that this was no longer necessary. There may be competition now with capitalist competitors in markets, but there wasn't an ideological competition anymore with socialism as it really existed. Then also in this period, starting really in the '80s, was the rise of China and its enormous effect on global markets. And this enabled firms to do a great deal, Western firms, to do a great deal of their manufacturing in China. We saw a hugely increased global competition for investment and a lot of what came to be called hot money, capital moving in and out of places very rapidly. Outsourcing and subcontracting were facilitated by new technologies. We talk a lot about telecommunications, but equally important in terms of goods shipping was containerization. So we had, and the two actually work together, because when you look at these big ports now with all the stacked up containers in them, they know where every one of those containers came from and where it's going as a result of very complicated computer logistics. We often think of these companies in the Far East as being independent, but in fact, many of them are actually just subcontractors to Western firms, which essentially have moved their production out and also, of course, parked their revenues in various places to avoid taxation. Although, interestingly, American firms put their money in the Netherlands a lot because you have a lower corporate tax rate. Neoliberalism is an ideology that supports this new competitiveness in world markets. And it isn't just competition among firms, it's competition among localities. So the elements of neoliberalism are a faith in markets. I just read somewhere that Adam Smith only used the term the invisible hand once and didn't mean it quite the way it's now come to mean, but that the argument is that the market coordinates everything and that by relying on the market and relying on competition, you have a result that is optimal. Well, in order to have the market work and get, quote, get the prices right, you have to get rid of regulations because regulations, and again I use the term that conventional economists use, regulations distort the market. The ideas of Joseph Schumpeter that economic growth is a consequence of entrepreneurship has become very much to the fore, and we always see these examples like Bill Gates and what's his name, the guy from Apple, my mind, Steve Jobs, yeah, thanks, is held up as models, even though many of the firms which are doing very well are not really entrepreneurial in that sense at all. But the argument in terms of municipal policy is that what every municipality has to do is to capture growth and do it through encouraging entrepreneurship, which you do by getting rid of regulation, by giving different kinds of subsidies to business. Governmental functions which previously were carried out by the government have been devolved to either nonprofits or private firms. A great deal of it is subcontracting. Again, the argument is that the private market is simply more efficient than government. The welfare state is seen as dampening incentives, as removing capital from its most productive uses, and there's always the underlying assumption that if we have growth and if capital is being very productive, then everybody will benefit. The city in this viewpoint is a unit, is a single whole, and whatever accrues to it, if its GDP goes up, then somehow it will trickle down. In the neoliberal city, property development has become the focus of public policy. Because most investment comes from the private sector, the way in which municipal governments can directly affect private investment is predominantly through making it easier for real estate developers, property developers to build. And this is seen as key to providing space that firms will then wish to occupy. Public-private partnerships have become the agent for building, and this usually involves a public sector participation of some sort, either relaxing of regulation or relaxing of taxation or providing some low-interest loans or whatever in combination with a private development partner. I remember I was in Germany, in Cologne, in the 1980s, and attended or gave a talk in a conference on public-private partnerships. There were a lot of German bureaucrats there, and they were shocked at the idea that the private sector should be carrying out functions that had formerly belonged to government, but now it's routine. It's true in all the European countries. It's true everywhere. So government increasingly takes on the function of being a deal maker. And if you're in if you're a planner in an economic development office in a city, what you spend a lot of your time doing is simply negotiating deals rather than making plans, which making plans wasn't always that useful, because many plans never came to fruition, and the thing about making deals is that you actually make them and something happens. So it's kind of exciting, but at the same time it means that you have government behaving much more like a profit-making private actor. In order for politicians to show that they've really accomplished something, they particularly emphasize mega projects, big stadiums, big housing developments, new port facilities, because if you're a politician, you can wave your hand at it and it's new and it looks good and everybody sees that you've done something. While more subtle forms of investment in, for example, education, take a very long time to come to fruition, and by then somebody else is in office. We've seen in the United States a total retreat from the construction of public housing. In Europe, with not as great a withdrawal, but certainly a withdrawal, and definitely in the Netherlands, a move from most housing being built as social housing to a relatively small percentage, and also the devolution of control over social housing from public bodies to housing associations. In my life as a teacher of planning, where when I first started teaching, most all my students were connected with poverty alleviation programs of some kind, or many were, increasingly they became oriented towards economic development, what strategies you should follow to make cities competitive, and within planning agencies, likewise, the emphasis switched from environmental concerns to economic development concerns. Richard Florida, who actually was once upon a time my student when he was an undergraduate, wrote this book on the rise of the creative class. So all these city governments have decided that what you need to do is foster creativity, and it's creative individuals that will make for a more competitive city. Well, none of these criteria having to do with growth and efficiency have any real bearing on what happens to the people who are relatively disadvantaged in a city, in a society. For my work all the time that I had been doing research since the 1970s was concerned with the distributional impacts of planning programs, but I reached a point where I really wanted to make my theoretical basis for the evaluations I did more precise. So I embarked on first some papers and then the book, The Just City. I attempted to use political philosophers the works of political philosophers to derive criteria that would define justice. The criteria that I came up with were trifold: democracy, diversity, and equity. And I'm not going to here go through the theoretical reasoning, but simply to mention that the works of John Rawls, Martha Nussbaum, Iris Marion Young, and Nancy Fraser were key to how I developed these. Just most briefly from Rawls's difference principle emphasizes equity primarily in material terms. Martha Nussbaum, who just came out with a new book, of which she seems to come out with one every year, all of which are 600 pages long, she argued that material well-being was insufficient, that there were a number of different aspects that make for a decent life, which are necessary in order to have a just society. Iris Marion Young said we can't, just as modern economics tends to do, see only individuals and firms. We have to see people as parts of affiliative groups. And so her book that was very influential was called Justice and the Politics of Difference. There was a move to saying that, well, what really mattered was recognition of the other, recognition of diversity. Nancy Fraser's work says, yes, that's important, but we also shouldn't lose sight of the economic basis for injustice. That injustice is not simply discrimination against people by race or color or gender or sexual preference, but in fact, being poor is not good, and we shouldn't forget that. Determining the justice of an urban policy, then, requires figuring out who got what out of it. That is, examining the distribution of benefits. Now, what has become rather dominant, or has been for some time, within planning theory is an emphasis on the planning process, an emphasis on Habermasian communicative rationality. The idea is if you get all these stakeholders with different views sitting around a table, that through reasoning together they can come to some consensual agreement which will then benefit all. It struck me that this hope was startlingly naive, that when you have very rich people and very powerful people sitting at the table with people who aren't rich and aren't powerful, that it isn't that likely that the consensus is going to benefit those people who aren't rich and aren't powerful. Even though I would say that communication and democracy and participation are good things in themselves, are desirable, are part of justice, that there is nothing that says that a good process produces a good outcome, that a democratic process produces a just outcome. In fact, in my own country right now, what we see at the grassroots is this move of the Tea Party, which you might be familiar with, which is probably the most effective grassroots movement we've seen in the United States since the Civil Rights Movement. And there is nothing about it that's committed to what I would call justice, although certainly the people in it, in their definition of justice, think that that what they want is what is just. What they want is essentially religion and support for the wealthy, although they don't quite see it that way. Rather, what they see it as they don't want to be taxed. And somehow the logical jump that says if they're not being taxed, Bill Gates isn't being taxed either, seems to not quite penetrate there. But at any rate, we cannot say that grassroots movements are necessarily progressive. And yet there's a sort of assumption in much of the literature on citizen participation that if you consult the people will come up with a progressive solution. Or if they sit down and negotiate in a Habermasian way, that then they will change their minds. Well, why should justice, and this is the justification of justice, why should justice be what we are seeking? Well, within capitalism, which is what we got everywhere now, relying simply on the market reinforces existing inequalities. There's an old expression, those who have get, and that if you don't have anything to invest in a market, you're not going to get much return. As I already said, wealth produces power resources so that during a negotiation there isn't a level playing field. That even if you are a well-meaning planner and you want to include everybody in deliberation, we have all these jurisdictional lines, which mean that, for example, the potential occupants of social housing aren't around to be in the negotiation because right now they're living somewhere else. In general, and I've observed a lot of participation in different kinds of neighborhoods, that renters tend not to participate nearly as much as owners, particularly in suburban areas. The effort to develop consensus tends, in fact, to support neoliberalism because within this consensus-building process, those people who have the resources to make their views known, to advertise, to pressure politicians, are the ones who come out the best. So if instead of saying, well, we'll negotiate or we'll be competitive, we just say, okay, we want to follow policies that produce more just outcomes, you're cutting into a vicious circle where disadvantage is constantly producing more disadvantage. So in my book and in my work, I've looked primarily at 3 cities, New York, London, and Amsterdam. In the book, I've evaluated what policies have come out of these cities. Now, New York, during the middle 1970s, had an extreme fiscal crisis. It would have been bankrupt had it not been saved from bankruptcy by deals that were made between banks, unions, and the city, whereby much of the city's fiscal autonomy was taken away and administered by a committee that consisted primarily of bankers, which was known as Big Mac. And then there was a state-level organization called the Emergency Financial Control Board, and these organizations made sure that the revenues that the city got were used to pay off bonds, and that there was virtually no capital spending for another number of years. Then once really the global capitalist juggernaut of financial flows grew so much larger, where finance really replaced manufacturing as the driving force in the global economy, New York and London both, which had really been in population decline and financial decline, saw a huge reversal. Now, if you listen to the mayors who were around at the time, they'd say it was their policies that produced the reversal, and their policy, well, London didn't even have a mayor at the time, but their policies did, in fact, I think, support what was going on, but what really was important in terms of these global cities was the change in the character of global finance. So what you had in New York was the center of finance. And you had a city that was trying to respond to, or a city government trying to respond to the decline of manufacturing. New York had been the largest manufacturing city in America in terms of employment, with several million people working in manufacturing, and now it's a couple of 100,000 who work in manufacturing. Well, one of the things when people aren't working in manufacturing is you just have these vast areas which are of disused port facilities and plants and so forth. What planning, and particularly planning under the auspices of the Economic Development Office, became involved with was the development of projects. So in terms of what planners did in the planning department, they rezoned the city so that formerly manufacturing areas like Soho became residential areas. But otherwise, most efforts were project-based. So we saw the development, for example, of Battery Park City, a mega development on the Hudson River that was on landfill. Each new project was based on some kind of deal. In particular, New York gave away enormous amounts of tax revenue, which European countries don't do things in quite this way, but although the UK has done so. For each project that a developer said, well, I'm going to build, and I'm going to show you a picture later of Columbus Center, I'm going to build this megastructure, then the city would say, okay, you don't have to pay any property tax for 15 years, 20 years, whatever number of years. And also that even though the zoning says you can't build more than 22 stories, you in fact can build 50 stories if that's what you want to do. Because we want investment. Now there's a certain sort of cargo cult aspect to this that says we'll encourage you to build buildings on spec, that is, buildings where you don't have a tenant in place, but once those buildings are there, companies will come and occupy them. Now actually, when I wrote a book called The City Builders, and in it I argued that this was really kind of silly, but it's not wholly untrue, as it turns out, because I've had students who've done theses who've asked firms why they went somewhere, and they'd say, well, we needed to go somewhere just then and space was available. So It'll work if, in fact, you're building the building someplace that a firm wants to go anyhow. On the other hand, if you're building it in a place where they don't want to go, then you've got empty buildings. So I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, which invested a great deal of money in building a new, quote, new downtown. And there's a very poignant documentary about Cleveland, which shows this relatively new office building on Public Square, which is the very center of Cleveland, where BP, Petroleum, had a building, which it had originally been a building that Ohio, which was Standard Oil of Ohio, was in. BP bought Standard Oil of Ohio. Then BP decided why stay in Cleveland when they could be in Texas? So they moved out, and in this documentary, it shows a security guard going through each floor of this shiny office building and saying, floor 32, empty. And then he goes down a floor 31, empty. And all he's doing is checking out to make sure everything is gone from the building. As far as I know, the building's still empty. Or Toledo, Ohio, which I once visited to give a lecture, they subsidized these buildings for glass companies. Toledo was the auto glass capital of the world, that is windshields. Well, they all moved to Texas too. So in New York, they built these buildings, and in fact, people did come and occupy them. Although, given the property cycle, they didn't necessarily come right away, and a lot of developers also went bankrupt in the early 90s and again in the early 2000s. But right now, New York is booming, and all this space has been taken up. Under Mayor Bloomberg, who, as I'm sure many of you know, is one of the richest men in the world, I forget, he's the richest man in New York, and he ranks something like 6th in the world. He was very committed to open space and sustainability, which are subjects that I didn't spend that much time on in my book, but which certainly are part of a just city. He put a lot of money into some of the parks. He developed a plan for resilience that New York has made some substantial strides in making itself less vulnerable to storms. But one of the things that happened under Bloomberg, and this is one of the ways in which you really see how the world, that even people who think that they're being very public-oriented, they're very affected by the world in which they operate. So Bloomberg being a mega billionaire, the people he associated with primarily were people like him. And he saw the world through a certain lens, so huge amounts of money went into Central Park and Brooklyn Bridge Park, and these parks which are where the well-to-do live in New York. But the parks in the boroughs where poor people live didn't get much, and now under the new mayor, they just announced yesterday that they're putting a substantial amount of money into these parks where the pictures in the paper show the grass growing through the asphalt and various other signs of decay. Now, all the mayors since the 70s have set housing goals, but without national money, without money coming from the national government, the city has to depend on private developers to increase the supply of housing. So they've come up with these various formulas of so-called 80-20 housing where the developer can build higher than he would have or gets a subsidy, and in return he builds 80% of the building for the market and 20% in a cross-subsidy for new construction of affordable housing. But this amounts to trivial amounts of affordable housing. In the meanwhile, no new public housing, or practically no new public housing, has been built for decades. I will say for New York, however, in comparison to, say, Chicago, that it hasn't torn down the public housing that exists, while Chicago has torn down virtually all its public housing under a federal program called Hope 6, where it's supposedly replaced by mixed income housing, but where the number of people who actually get to go back is quite small. Both mayors, Giuliani and Bloomberg, focus on different mega projects as a village. The one that drives me nuts are the ones of spending, and Amsterdam is not exempt from this either, a great deal of money on sports venues. So Yankee Stadium, which was built for the richest team in baseball, which gets billions out of its broadcast rights, which always is full, but they decided the old stadium didn't afford enough so-called skyboxes for rich people to watch the game, actually usually on televisions in the skybox, but can drink and take their guests and what have you. They needed a new stadium. So they destroyed a public park. They built a new subway station. They built train connections. They had to build new parks to replace the old parks. So essentially, about $1 billion of public money went into this new palace for the New York Yankees. Of course, one of the rationales was that it would spin off business to places around it. But since within the stadium are restaurants, bars, even a bowling alley, I think, that it doesn't spin off anything, and that the facilities around it do less well than with the old stadium. In general, one of the issues with stadiums, and you can see it very much if you look at the Ajax Stadium in Amsterdam, is when there's a game, you see a lot of people around. And when there isn't a game, it's dead space. You don't see anyone around. So New York now has a new mayor who came into power with the rhetoric, actually, of justice. He talked about a tale of two cities, that New York was a city of the rich and a city of the poor. And in his first 9 months, I guess it is now, in office, he has in fact done a number of things which are redistributive. But needless to say, he has had to compromise. And one of the big problems is that even while he's seeing that more affordable housing is being added, about an equal amount is being subtracted because New York is one of the few cities in the United States that has rent control, or it's called rent stabilization. And there's a whole set of procedures whereby landlords can take the units out of rent stabilization, and they're taking them out just about as fast as new affordable housing is being put in. So in New York then, economic growth is indeed the priority. And here are two pictures of the two cities that de Blasio speaks about. On the left is public housing in Coney Island. Now, it's one of the things about actually this public housing is it's right on the beach, so that people actually have million-dollar views, but they have pretty crummy apartments, and New York City public housing is now running a huge deficit, and they are simply unable to make repairs. On the other hand, there is one of the mega projects that came on in 2003, which I guess was, can't remember if Giuliani was still in office or this was Bloomberg, but at any rate, this is the Time Warner Center. The bottom 5 floors is a deluxe shopping mall. Then it also has jazz at Lincoln Center, which is a nice amenity for those of us who like jazz. The restaurants there are the most expensive restaurants in New York, including Per Se, which Michelin gave 3 stars to, and which supposedly it costs you, I have not eaten there, but it supposedly will cost you about $1,000 a person to have dinner. Then that sort of step building on the right is the Mandarin Oriental Hotel. Then above it, the tower on the left, the shorter one, is an office building, and then the other 2 towers are condominiums for the very wealthy, many of whom, of course, don't live in New York more than a couple of weeks a year. And one of the phenomena New York is seeing, along with London, Paris, Hong Kong, Singapore, is the so-called ghost apartment, where very wealthy people from Asia, from South America, buy an apartment, buy it cash, which is a nice way of laundering your money, then have several other apartments in other places too. They don't live there, but they see this as a very good, stable investment. Now, the Bronx terminal market is a story that I was involved in, and which illustrates to me the way in which injustice is done in New York, and also, incidentally, the way in which community participation doesn't necessarily lessen injustice. The market was a wholesale food market. The purveyors were mainly immigrant businesses. They employed over 300 workers, most of whom were male, most of whom were immigrants, most of whom earned a living wage. A developer came along who was a good friend of the mayor's assistant, or the deputy mayor in charge of economic development, offered to build a modern shopping mall, which is what you see on the right. It's a very conventional shopping mall. The argument was the Bronx, which is very poor, didn't have this kind of shopping, and now it would. But in fact, it's located in such a way that you have to drive to it pretty much, and the people who use it are ones who are on the expressway next to it and drive on, drive off. It did add more jobs than were subtracted, but the type of jobs and the type of people who have them are quite different. It's mainly part-time workers, teenage girls who work in the typical kind of mall store. And while I'm not saying that teenage girls shouldn't have access to jobs, it displaced a lot of workers who simply, when the market moved, a few of the bigger enterprises were able to move and maintain their clientele, but most of them simply, as often happens when you displace businesses, simply lost their patronage and went out of business. The shopping mall was sold not only as producing economic development, but producing a very desirable amenity, and there were these renderings from designers showing people sitting outside at cafe tables, drinking cappuccino. And what you have to understand about this locale is it's right under a major expressway, the Major Deegan Expressway. If you're there, there are pigeon droppings that come down, there are pieces of rust that come down. It is not any place where anybody is going to sit and drink their cappuccino outdoors, and in fact, all that part of the renderings just never came into existence. But we see this all the time. We see these big projects being sold as delightful places that everybody will enjoy. And to be fair, there was some effort under Bloomberg, there you see him, to distribute funds more widely. So the Hunts Point Greenway was built as part of the mayor's plan for sustainability, was built in the poorest part of the Bronx, but in fact they probably would never have built it were it not for the fortuitous happening of Hurricane Sandy, which caused the federal government to give money to the city for repair after the hurricane, and so they designated this project as an area that was affected by the hurricane, and so they didn't spend city money, they spent federal money, which they don't usually get. Now, New York also has a strong virtue in that it is a very diverse city. It's much more welcoming of immigrants certainly than other western and southern parts of the United States. So we see on the streets a great variety of people and a much greater willingness to accept immigrants. On the other hand, New York remains a highly ethnically and racially segregated city. I wrote a paper years ago called Amsterdam, the Egalitarian City, and I subsequently used Amsterdam. I was a visiting professor at the University of Amsterdam in the 80s. I subsequently used Amsterdam as an exemplar of a, quote, realistic utopia. Aspects of Amsterdam which seem to make it just are that social housing was built, 90% of new housing after the war for quite a period was social housing, and it was built throughout the city. We don't have the kind of income segregation that we have in the United States. People could moor their houseboat and get public services. But I don't know if you get this program called House Hunters International, but it's a cable program that we get in the United States. And I was shocked to find that, because they featured people buying a houseboat in Amsterdam recently, that a houseboat in Amsterdam now costs over $1 million or €1 million. We've seen gentrification of the canals. At one time you could say, well, here was this mansion in Herengracht, and right below it was a houseboat with a bunch of hippies with no money, but that has changed. But there was certainly a huge amount of social housing built. Because the municipality owns the land and that most properties are leasehold rather than freehold, You can't speculate in land the way you can in the United States, where almost all land can be bought and sold. And when I first came here, I remember asking a professor at the university why developers were willing to accept this system where land had to be released by the public sector in order to build on it. And he said, well, they can't make the kinds of profits that American developers make, but on the other hand, they have no risk. They know that when they build, they're going to get the return that they expect to get. So they were pretty satisfied with that for a very long time. However, most recently, there has been a very large reduction in the commitment to social housing, and consequently, the price of housing is set by the market to a much greater extent than it had been. There's gentrification, especially in the Jordan. I was a little shocked. I had dinner with, well, first I interviewed somebody who was the deputy director of planning or of economic development, or I don't quite remember what, but at any rate, I talked to him about this retrenchment in social housing, and he said quite proudly, yes, we are becoming a normal city. And I thought, oh. And so that night at dinner at a friend's, and there was a group of the great and good of Amsterdam, I was sitting next to a man, and I recounted this. And I said, I was a little shocked by this. And he said, yes, isn't this wonderful? He said, we're becoming a normal city at last. And he turned out to be, in fact, the director of planning. So you've seen a real change in Amsterdam in the mentality of people who are running the city, a much greater buying in to the neoliberal ideology. And if you look at the output of even scholars who I quite like at the university, one of the books that Sacco Muster did a few years ago, I believe was called A Competitive City. Now, one of the examples of the way in which Amsterdam is changing is the Bijlmermeer, which was built entirely as social housing, which turned out to be very unpopular with native Dutch, and thus became a concentration of immigrants, although still a majority Dutch. They've torn down parts of it, and they have built market housing within it. There's a very interesting book by Theo Bart, which interviews has photos, and it's photojournalism, and interviews people in the Bijlmermeer who moved into the new parts, into the condos. And interestingly, they are people who had originally lived in the rental social housing who wanted to stay in the area. And in fact, the private part tends to be heavily ethnic as well as the rental part. But it shows the way in which, as Dutch society became more affluent, that people increasingly wanted to live like people in the United States or people in Great Britain, and the commitment to a much more uniform kind of housing that was socialist in inspiration faded away. I gave a talk recently in Amsterdam at a cafe where they have public events. And I was talking about the retreat of social housing, and I noticed the audience, which was primarily people probably a little older than you, that is, people who were young professionals, weren't that interested in social housing. And basically in the question period, all they wanted to know was how they could enter the housing market, because essentially they made too much money to be eligible, well, or they may have been eligible for social housing, but they'd be on a waiting list for 8 years. But private housing was too expensive for them. And so you have this niche, which is kind of not supplied for, and you have in Amsterdam a great deal of competition to get whatever housing you can get. Now this is the Western Garden suburbs. The buildings were originally built after the war according to a plan that it is still a very heavily Turkish area, but there is urban revitalization going on there, so they've torn down a number of the buildings, and they're building, some of them they just renovated, and the people living there are pretty much the same people as were living there, but the new ones are very mixed in terms of affordability. And you all read Dutch, which I don't, but as I understand it, about a third, not even 51, are social housing, and then it goes up to moderate and full market rate, and some are owner and some are renter. Now, most recently, I have been teaching in Singapore. I've done it now for 4 years, and this has been an education for me. It's a very different place. And it does many of the things that in the courses that I've taught over the years in redevelopment I said were the wrong things to do. But in fact, it does them so well that they turn out to be, in many ways, the right thing to do. So what you have in Singapore is truly comprehensive planning, where in the West now every project is a deal. That's not at all the case in Singapore, where the government says, okay, this is what's going to go here, and this is what's going to go there, and this is where new towns are going to be, and this is how many units are going to be in this new town, and this is where the subway is going to go, etc. So that land use and transportation planning are fully integrated. There's a great deal of open space planning, a huge commitment to connecting all the parks in Singapore. So you have this city-state with a small land area, about the same area as New York. They think they must be the densest place on Earth, but in fact they have less density than New York or Paris. But they have considerable density, particularly since a part of the island is reserved for military uses, and so they can't build on that. You've had leadership by the same party since the 1960s, the PAP, under Lee Kuan Yew for decades, and now his son is the prime minister. So we're talking about, it's something, they use the term often, authoritarianism with a light touch. It is authoritarian. When the government decides something, it happens, but they are somewhat open to other inputs, and there is an opposition party, which has some number of seats, 8, in the parliament, which is called the Workers' Party, and the elections, they have free and fair elections. On the other hand, the media is dominated by the PAP, so the opposition doesn't get much of a voice in it. In the university, you can say whatever you want, and I do, but if I stood on a street corner, I would probably be arrested for doing so. There, as well as in Amsterdam or Stockholm, there is public ownership of land. I've come to really believe that in order to have really effective good planning, the public does have to own the land. That it's the only way to dampen land speculation and to keep the price of land, or to prevent the price of land from driving the price of everything else. Lee Kuan Yew, interestingly, as were the people in Amsterdam at the beginning of the 20th century, was influenced by the economist Henry George, who was an American economist who said that the amount that land increases in value as a result of development is the unearned increment. As a result, not of the investment of the person who owns the land in it, but rather as the investment around it. So that you own a piece of property on, and I'll use the US as an example, on one of the main interstate routes. Some big shopping mall gets built on one side and a hotel on the other, and your piece of land in which you haven't done a blessed thing but own it suddenly quintuples in value. Why should the owner of that land, just because she or he owned it, get this increase in value? So Henry George thought that there should be a total confiscation of this so-called unearned increment. I had lunch the other day with a woman who was my friend for many years. Sadly, her husband recently died, so she sold their New York apartment. They had bought the apartment for close to $1 million. Her husband was a wealthy man. I don't know, 10, 12 years ago maybe. She just sold it for $4 million. Well, it isn't because of her decor that it increased. In fact, she said the real estate agent told her to take out everything that she had put in it, that the people who bought it wanted it stripped. So it isn't a consequence. This is one of the things that makes it's different about real property as opposed to other kinds of goods, is that its increase in value is not a result simply of investment. Its increase in value is an externality of what's invested around it. So if you had public ownership of land, you're in a much better position as planners to determine what's going to be there and what the outcomes are. Singapore has a combination of garden city planning, that is neighborhood clusters, which at the center in walkable distance are all the things you need for your daily life. Our hawkers markets, which sell very cheap food, both cooked and uncooked, which sell goods like hardware, clothing, etc. So if you're a low-income Singaporean, you can actually live reasonably decently by simply patronizing the hawkers centers. It's an interesting way of handling economic inequality because basically there's consumption at every level. But if you're at the bottom, you can still have a cooked meal every night that you don't even have to cook yourself for very little money. Then, also in this core, there'll be a shopping mall where the more middle-class people eat in more like fast food restaurants. There's always a food court in the bottom, and there's stores, and some of them on the kind of base will have what we in the States call dollar stores, or they call $2 stores, but a Singapore dollar is worth less than a US dollar. But as you go up, by the time you get to the top, you get to Cartier and Dior. And in fact, in the city, I don't think there could be any place that have as many branches of the most expensive jewelers and haberdashers and couturiers. All, you just see them in numerous quantities. So it has these neighborhoods. Then it has a central business district, which is connected to all the neighborhoods by excellent mass transit. Then the buildings, I mean, what's interesting is what you might call the urban design or urban form, the spatial form, is that of Ebenezer Howard, but the architecture is that of Le Corbusier. So it's towers in the park. They call themselves the city in the garden, and there are gardens everywhere, and every housing project is surrounded by garden. The Housing Development Board is a government agency. 85% of Singapore's citizens live in social housing, or they call it public housing. And that this development of public housing is what has driven the physical city, because it's really where the Housing Development Board develops, that creates the different nodes in the city. And it's the driver of the social city as well, because they have very strict rules about who should live in it and how they should live. So that it has something called the ethnic integration policy. Every single building in HDB housing has to have a population that's proportionate to the population of the city. 70% Chinese, 17% Malay, 7% Indian. And they all have got it so that they're very concerned with maintaining ethnic pluralism. But there's a sort of contradiction here because it also maintains ethnic identity, since you have to say what you are in order to live there. And then in order to get an apartment, you've got to be married. So there's a very big emphasis on the nuclear family. And then you're supposed to take care of mom and dad when they're old, and so you get special rates if your parents are going to live in, say, the apartment next door. So I want to wrap this up. Singapore today still keeps, and it keeps raising the income level that's entitled to live in public housing because they want economic integration. So people can get wealthier and still be eligible. The quality of the housing they're building gets higher and higher, so that the newest HDB housing looks like private condos, and they tear down ones that have become obsolete, but they move everybody first, as they put it, en bloc. So all the people in the building get moved to another building before where they're living gets torn down, and they are able to stay together. They do, as I said before, capture the unearned increment. And it's so complicated, I don't really want to get involved in this, but basically you own your unit, even though the HDB owns the building and the surroundings, and so you can sell your unit. And people depend on being able to sell their unit to have money in their old age. And so they don't want the price of resale, of the resale market, to drop too much, but they don't want it to grow too much either, because then that produces inflation. And so they control the amount of housing available and the price of housing by increasing or decreasing new supply. So you see in the background some newly built public housing that's very stylish. Then just below it, you see the older kind of public housing. You see historic preservation, and on your left you see a big shopping mall. And this is quite in the center. This is some of the new HDB housing in one of these so-called new towns. And it's a little impersonal, no question, but on the other hand, this is a style of Asian cities which initially people who lived in villages resisted strongly being moved into high-rise, but now the higher you can be, the better it's considered. Whether or not the models of either Amsterdam or Singapore can be exported to other places is questionable. Their historic paths are different. They responded, in the case of the Netherlands, of course, planning was in many respects a response to water. In Singapore, it was a response to being kicked out of Malaysia. You couldn't, I don't think, introduce the kind of benevolent authoritarianism that Singapore has to the West, but it might work fairly well in some other parts of the world. And they have very specific geographic locations. But I think you can pull some general principles out of these examples, which is that public ownership of land creates the potential for good planning and for equity, even though it doesn't necessarily have that outcome. That diversity can be handled in a variety of ways, of which the Singapore way is perhaps a little, when I was teaching my class there in Singapore, there's a Nigerian woman from Lagos, and she said, "No one's going to tell me who I'm going to live next door to." Forced integration raises issues. Whether you need to have democracy and participation to have just outcomes depends, I think you'd say, on the particular context. In terms of the European model, of which, as well as Amsterdam, I could name Vienna or Stockholm or maybe Oslo as being places that provide a great deal of public benefit and have, if you look at the list of Gini coefficients, a good deal of income equality. The question is whether they can withstand austerity and the ideological attack by the neoliberals, coming, of course, very much out of the European Central Bank. I tried to, in the book, say, okay, these were general principles. What kinds of policies would specifically embody these general principles? And I'm not, you can read this, but let me just summarize by saying that it means that you have to keep supplying affordable housing, that it isn't good enough to just say, well, we'll give somebody a rent voucher and have them go look for some place to live, that involuntary relocation in order to achieve economic development, we'll clear you all out here so we can build another stadium, is really a bad idea. In the case of Singapore, where people were involuntarily relocated out of their villages, which had no sanitation and no running water, and they still didn't necessarily want to leave, but they moved into much better housing, was not a bad thing, but it was not a bad thing because, in fact, along with it, they all got jobs, that there was this enormous amount of economic development that went on at the same time. That economic development programs ought to give priority to the interests of employees and small business owners, the exact opposite of what happened in my Bronx Terminal Market example, where big shopping mall developer, in fact the biggest developer in New York, developed it, and all the stores are chain stores. That if you're going to build a mega project, and there are a lot of places where it is appropriate, especially in disused waterfronts where there's just all these sagging piers, but that you have to ensure that, that they give benefits to those people who are relatively disadvantaged. So right now in New York, Mayor de Blasio is demanding that in the new mega projects which are underway, that the people working in them, that any place that gets any kind of government benefit, that the people working in them should get a living wage. So one of the questions that people have often raised is, well, can the local government really do anything, or doesn't it all depend on national governments? Well, the United States in that respect is actually an interesting example because there's so much variation from place to place. So that we have a mayor in New York now who is limited in what he can do because of lack of federal support and because the New York state government hampers him in various ways, but nevertheless is doing things which are important and which do make a difference and which are within the power of locality. I also would say that if we just talk about justice, for a period of time, if you were in a planning meeting and you said, well, but that isn't really a just policy, people would look at you as if you were hopelessly naive or some kind of Marxist or somebody who just wasn't realistic and hard-headed and the kind of person that should be a planner. So that changing the discourse is important. However, discourse alone, and this is where I break with the Habermasians, discourse alone doesn't produce good outcomes, and that you have to always be evaluating the content of the discourse, the content of the policy, not simply the process by which it's conducted. In conclusion, then, the wide variety that we see in the capitalist world, in capitalist political economies, shows that there is potential for more or less justice. I'm not going to say for the just city, but for a more just city or a less just city. The reason I first came to Amsterdam, before even the time I was a visiting professor, I had a student, and it was sometime in the 70s, and I'd become kind of friendly with him. He was a master's student. I mentioned that I had a sabbatical, and I was going to go to Stockholm because I wanted to see how cities that were still capitalist nevertheless had a much higher degree of welfare than American cities. So I wanted to see how they planned, what they did. He said, oh, don't go to Stockholm, it's so boring. And come to Amsterdam instead, because Amsterdam was much more ethnically diverse. At that time, Stockholm really hadn't had much immigration. It was a much livelier city. It had excellent policies. And so I did come to Amsterdam, and I've been coming there ever since. Then finally, just to say, to reiterate, that if justice is your governing principle within the realms of public policy making, then the discourse about what are appropriate policies simply are very different from the discourse if competitiveness is your rubric. Thank you.